Apparently I did not talk about the perks yet. Can you believe it? We have to change that. So we will go through the entire list and I will share my opinions and maybe rate some of them, how useful they are and when you want to use them. First off, for almost all perks there is a situation where they would be useful. So there are no really useless perks per se. Well, maybe one, but basically most perks can be useful in a certain situation. That's what I want to say. The first one is the Adjacency perk bonus. And this gives you an extra perk slot in your outpost for each other outpost you control in adjacent sectors. So for each gate connection, you can choose one more perk in the outpost which has this perk unlocked. Usually you only have 3 perk slots per outpost. And this only makes sense if you have more than one gate connection. So if your sector is connected to 2 other sectors and you also control these and have outposts placed in there, then you can use this perk to get an extra perk. And this can stack up to 4 times because 4 is the maximum gate connections that you can get. 1 in the north, 1 in the east, 1 in the south, and 1 in the west. And this gives you 3 extra perks because you need 1 extra slot to unlock this in the first place. This is often seen as a bit of a no-brainer, so when you can benefit from it, you should unlock it. And that is really true. It is very powerful, but it can also be a bit of a trap, in my opinion. Because what you should never do is to choose your initial first couple sectors when you still don't have your ship industry up and running and you're just starting out and you are choosing the general area where you want to settle. Then this perk, if you want to choose your sectors based on how many sector connections you can get from this perk, and this can lure you into settling in a very dangerous area. Because the areas where many neutral sectors are available and where you can expand easily and get a lot of these connections, those are the areas which are rather tough. Yeah, that's the right word. You have pirates, you have xenon, you have few trade partners. I think it's a bad idea. You have a bad access to get more resources going and your freighters will be the prime target for all the baddies which are flying there. So yeah, it's a no-brainer perk, but it can be a trap. So be careful not to focus too much on that. But if you can take it and benefit from it, then yeah, sure, go for it. Then we have Advanced Engineering. This is a pure ship construction perk. It is only useful on the outposts which are intended to produce your ships. And it will increase the construction time, but decrease the maintenance cost of those ships which are produced there. So you kind of want this, because less maintenance means that your fleet can be bigger, right? But I would not rate this to be an absolute must-have. It's more a nice-to-have perk on your outposts. Further down the list, we will see that there are much more important perks for your shipyard, and this is one which is, to be honest, not that critical. Even if the reduced maintenance is really good, but you're paying that with a higher construction time, you're paying that with the additional perk that you have to unlock. So that is really a bit tricky because in the early game you are mostly limited by the amount of resources that you have, the amount of ship crafting components. That's what's really the limiting factor for your fleet size, and the credits paying the maintenance when your fleet is still very small is not that big of a deal in my opinion. And later in the game, when you have multiple shipyards and many factories to supply resources for them, then the construction time gets to be a much larger factor in determining how big your fleet can be, how fast you can replace your losses. But then also the reduced maintenance is more important because your fleet is bigger. So honest opinion, I think In the early game, this is less useful because in the early game you have what I would call perk greed. You have a lot of critical perks that you need to establish your basic infrastructure, and this is mostly just a discount. It basically just gives you money, it saves you money, but it doesn't allow you to do new things. It's not a core enabler of a new strategy or something like that. So there are much more important perks, but it is a good shipyard perk. Cheaper stations. This reduces the cost of all stations that you build in this outpost by 50%. And this is a really solid perk. You only really need it once in your empire because it is often useful if you focus your entire station production, all your building projects in one outpost. You should do that anyway because this outpost will level up and it will become cheaper and quicker to produce stations. And then you can take this perk. This gives you an extra bonus and it's really nice. The cost of stations is not that large when you compare it to the cost of ships, but it's still a huge discount, especially in the early game. And when your outpost is still low level, the station crafting specialization is still low, then the discount will of course be higher too. So a very solid perk. Definitely take it in your station crafting outpost. The dry dock. Yeah, let's make it quick. It's the best perk in the game. Simple as that. The description in this video is for my rebalance mod in the original Mayhem 3 game. In the original base mod. The dry dock perk it's overpowered, okay? Basically, it disables the maintenance cost for your docked ships, and that allows you to just build an indefinite amount of military ships. You have a limited amount of docking clamps for the very big capital ships, but for the small and medium ships, you have an indefinite docking port capability. So you can basically ramp up your fleet size and your power indefinitely. Just dock them, they won't cost anything, and you can just sit there and CETA and let the resources flow in, build more and more ships. They all don't cost you anything as long as they are docked to an outpost with the dry dock. And then you can just defeat any enemy, really any enemy with overpowered fleets. Just run over them and your invasion will not take that long because you're so overpowered with so many ships. And during that time when they are actually ruffle stomping your enemy, they will cost a lot, of course, but then you can just, when you're done, you just dock them back at the dry dock and you can get rid of the entire cost. And that's also the reason why I have, nerfed this perk in the ground. In my rebalance, it only reduces the maintenance cost to 50% and also has another feature that it can slowly undo the permanent cost increase that all ships have to suffer. But in the base game, this is, it's basically an exploit, in my opinion. The electromagnetic pulse. This gives the outpost a new ability. It can unleash an EMP, and this will fry all shields in the sector, enemies and yours. Of course, you want to use it when there are strong enemies in your sector. And there's also a mobile version that you can install on large transports. This will consume energy, and it is a really good defensive perk. But it is very situational, so that is one of those perks that is only really useful in very specific locations, in very specific situations. But when you can benefit from this, then you can benefit a lot, because most capital ships, the big ships, they have an insane amount of HP in shield strength, and their hull is actually not that big. So in an instant, you can erase the entire health bar of any capital ship. and this is just a very powerful defensive measure. And then you can rush in through a jump beacon or something and kill the ships when their shields are still down. So very strong, but most of the time you won't have to deal with this perk. It's a bit of a gimmick, yeah. Extra engine tuning. Clearly another shipyard perk. This just makes all ships built by this outpost a teeny tiny bit faster. And this is a perk that I always want to have. I always want to get this, but sadly, it's just not good enough. And oftentimes you have to forego this in favor of other perks. It's a typical nice to have shipyard perk, and there are many. Shipyards are the outposts which require the most perks, easily the most perks. So you want to have as many features as you can get, like advanced engineering. That was the other one we covered. Extra engine tuning is really good because speed is critical in Mayhem 3. Speed determines that you have the initiative to engage battles at your will, to run away from battles, and also catch enemies for your patrols. The only problem is that your perks on your shipyards are really limited. So if you have an extra perk slot to spare, and surprise, surprise, you won't, then you definitely want to get this. But if you still have to unlock other more critical perks, then you should give this one a pass. Because you will not change the core behavior of any ship. A corvette will not be able to instantly catch an enemy fighter. The speed will be higher, but the difference is just not good enough to justify that you take this perk in most cases, from my opinion. Faster research. This increases your research rate by 50%. I don't like this perk. No, don't at all. There is basically only one time frame, only one phase in the game when you really benefit from this perk, and that is the mid game. In the early game, you won't have any major research projects, or they are so far away. You only have maybe one research station, and all will take very long. In the late game, you will have all the research projects that you wanted already completed. So the only phase this is useful is the mid game, when you are on your way towards researching your first capital ships. And with this perk, you can do that faster and unlock those bigger ships faster. But all that it does is that it saves you time. And once you're done with your research, this perk does nothing anymore for you. So this is one of the perks that I don't have the slightest problem of giving a pass. There are instances where this is really useful. Later on, you will have many sectors that you don't need for anything specific. Your first maybe 4 or 5 outposts are usually dedicated to specific tasks. They have specific roles, and you really need them to produce your ships or do other stuff, produce your factories or weapons or whatever. But then later in the game, when you have maybe 10 outposts or 15, then you will have many sectors which don't have a specific task. And in those outposts, you will have all the perk slots that you need. You won't know which perks you should even choose. And for those outposts, this is the perfect kind of perk. And it's really a dump perk, in my opinion. It only saves you time. It doesn't enable any feature. It doesn't do anything. It's only useful if you really don't have anything else what you want to have in that outpost. And you will have outposts which have no need for other perks really. So then you can take this. Free interorbital storage. The interorbital storage is a magic chest. You can send resources from any outpost into the magic chest, and then the magic chest can send resources to another outpost somewhere in the game world. This always takes time and it has a cost, and with this perk it will be free. That sounds good on paper, but using this interorbital storage is pretty clumsy. You can't automate it, so it's really more for the kind of special tactics when you have a certain outpost which is maybe in a dangerous spot, it is overrun by enemies, the entire sector is swarming, and you still want to do something with that station and need some resources there or whatever. So more for emergencies, and it is only manual control. So overall, I don't really use this feature that much, but I usually have an outpost where I unlock this eventually so that I can send resources into this outpost with agent ships, and then this outpost can beam those resources into the cloud basically. And if I need something anywhere, I can just download the resource basically. So the storage size is, I think it is unlimited, but the amount of the bandwidth, how many resources you can send or retrieve in one go, that is severely limited. So it takes a lot of time to get a lot of resources to or from the storage. So overall, not that useful. Maybe I'm using it wrong, but one of the less useful perks in my opinion. The hacking station. This perk is the key enabler for the entire hacking system, plain and simple. If you want to use that, you have to choose that perk. Eventually, you want to play around with it, and you will have a lot of outposts, so you will have a lot of free perk slots, and then you can take this perk. But maybe your playthrough is also centered around the hacking system somehow. I can certainly think about some cool strategies that you might be doing. For example, you can get pretty early access to large capital ships with the hacking system. But I think we can all agree that the entire hacking system is a bit more optional. It is a gimmick, yeah. So not that critical of a perk either. The insurance policy protects your outpost from unfortunate events. Almost all of them are especially bad if they happen on your shipyard. And the risk, the chance for a bad event increases with the population. If you have more people, then you will have more bad events. That's just the way it is. And since more people is also good production, you usually choose those sectors to become your ship production location. And those events can get really, really nasty. And I personally consider this perk to be a must-have on your shipyard. It is one of those shipyard perks which is almost critical. And it definitely comes, it has a higher priority than the engine tuning and then the advanced engineering perk. So if I can't get the insurance policy, then I'm not taking those two perks either. This has a higher priority. And it is only topped by the laser manufacture. The laser manufacture is the only real perk that you need, that you absolutely need to get a decent shipyard outpost. You can also produce your weapons in a different outpost, separated from your ships. This will save this perk slot, but I absolutely don't recommend this. I don't know if I have stated something different in my previous videos, but with the knowledge that I have right now, no, just don't do it. Never build your weapons in a different location. Have this in one spot. Laser Manufacture is the only real perk that is absolutely critical for any shipyard. And these two are my go-to perks for any shipyard, really. Laser Manufacture always, and insurance policy almost as critical. It will save you a lot of hassles. You can get storage fire events, then you lose random resources, and your shipyards are usually the outposts where you are hoarding and stockpiling all your resources, so it is especially bad if it happens there. Then you have certain events which can increase your maintenance for all future built ships, or even nastier events when the plot progresses further. Your people can die off and then your production speed goes down, so it's all really bad. And you should just always disable that. Completely protect yourself against these events. And on other less useful outposts, it doesn't really matter that much. But Laser Manufacture and Insurance Policy is my go-to perk duo for shipyards. Then we have Missile Manufacturing. Missiles are optional, so you don't have to use them. I like to use them because it allows you to have that extra bit of firepower at the ready. You can just increase your missile usage through a fleet commander and just activate missiles basically and keep them deactivated to save them when you don't need them. And this way you can deal more damage with the same amount of ships. If you build more ships, you also have to pay more maintenance. And if you have missiles, then you still have more damage, maybe not as much than if you would build another ship, but you're also not paying additional maintenance. And what you really want to have, if you don't want to use missiles, you should at least use missile defense. Because the NPCs will certainly use missiles, and if you don't defend yourself with chaff systems and the CCDS, then you will receive a lot more unnecessary damage. So chaff is really cheap, missile defense is really cheap, and to get that automated, you really need this perk. But the good news is you don't need it in a shipyard outpost. You can safely outsource this to another outpost, which doesn't have as much of a shortage in perk slots like shipyards usually do, where you want to choose a lot of different perks and want to unlock basically everything. And Missile Manufacture can be in some other remote outpost. Just establish a steady resource supply with silicon wafers, and then you just need some supply ships which can be automated for your fleets, and they will just order those missiles from the outposts which have this perk, and then produce them and load them up and deliver them to your fleets. So I would say it's a pretty good perk, but I know a lot of people think that missiles are too much of a hassle to bother with. But that also means you won't have good missile defense and you are suffering more damage. That means you have to build more ships. And that costs more maintenance. No food consumption. This is the coolest perk in the game. It's the coolest perk, but I really try to avoid taking it. This removes the need for food. The food system in this game is a bit strange. It's not really a resource which is that limited, because every outpost produces food and the production is much higher than the consumption. So overall, if you see the entire game world, there is a huge surplus of food. The only problem is that there are 4 different types of food, and your outpost always needs a different food from the one it is producing. And for the early game, this means that you always have to import your food, buy it from the NPCs. And it's not that cheap. So this perk can also save you a lot of money in the early game. But not only that, it also enables some pretty elaborate strategies, because you can basically set up outposts in fairly dangerous locations, because you don't need to supply them with anything. You can just have an outpost doing something, for example, researching or generating taxes, and you don't need to bring resources to this location with a freighter if you unlock this perk. So this is a really good Joker perk in my opinion. Always useful. The problem is, in the early game it's really justified because it saves a lot of money. But once you have outposts for each type of food that are producing each type of food that is in the game, then it's really no longer justified that you unlock it, because the only reason will be your own laziness. You just don't want to establish a proper supply solution. You could deliver the food, but it is too much work, so you choose this perk, and this is completely okay. But I usually try to avoid this perk. But later in the game, when you have so many more outposts and you also don't need all those perks anymore, you have free slots, then I usually also take this perk just to get rid of this food requirement and be done with it. And if you really hate how this mod, how Mayhem 3 handles this entire food situation, I know there are certainly people who hate it completely, then you can just increase your the default perk limit of 3. Just go to your T file in the configuration file and increase that to 4 and unlock this on any outpost. I won't blame you. You can just get rid of it and play this way if you want. Then we have the pirate contract. This prevents pirates in this sector from attacking your freighters. And this is again a very situational perk, but it can be really useful. And the best part is that it is one of those enabler perks. It enables you to unleash certain strategies that aren't possible. It allows you to survive in between pirate spawns where other factions have really trouble to keep their economy going. You can just settle there and be fine and unharmed. But of course, when the pirates are eventually wiped out, then this perk won't do anything anymore, and it's basically like the faster research, which also loses its usefulness eventually. The resupply drone perk is useless. It was useless in Mayhem 2, in my opinion, and there you still had jump fuel. So this drone, it's an NPC-controlled drone that will ferry resources from the outpost to ships in the same sector which need them. And the only thing in Mayhem 3 would be missiles. And for that you already have resupply ships from the fleet system. Maybe this would be more useful if the drone would also catch maybe resources from the miners. This could be a good idea if it emptied the mining ships out in the asteroid belts and transferred the minerals back home. But the only functionality is missile supply basically, and it's redundant, not really needed. Ring of Fire deploys a laser tower defense, and this is really good. At first this perk seems to be bad because it's a one-time thing. If the laser towers are getting destroyed, then this is also another perk wasted essentially. But the laser towers, they are fairly tough. Don't underestimate them, and especially against those pesky pirates which are flying around everywhere. Those can be really, really good. It's a very good stationary defense, a bit like the EMP, but more passive, more more automatic, and all on its own it will take care of most smaller incursions. And the laser towers, they are fairly beefy, so they don't go down that easily. So you will have a long-lasting benefit from this perk. And you shouldn't focus too much on getting a long-lasting benefit from a perk, because you can also use this at the border. Just establish a new sector, don't really build factories in there, but just pop an outpost in, unlock this perk, get your laser towers, and just have this as a kind of a buffer zone. When the enemy attacks, he will suffer losses. It makes it harder to take this sector. And if you lose the sector, you can retake it and then choose different perks. So it's not always about choosing perks which have a long-lasting effect for the entire game. Sometimes you just need a small injection of power, small one-time bonus that can also boost you so much that you can have a long-lasting benefit just from getting through that dangerous situation. And the Ring of Fire is definitely a secret weapon. And then we have two perks which are creating value, which are actually giving you stuff. The solar panels create energy cells in the outpost. And the production is the equivalent to 1.5 solar plants. So you are essentially trading factory slots, 1.5 factory slots of this sector against the perk slots. And that deal is not as good, because this is also dependent on the sun efficiency in the sector. So if you would just build a solar plant or 2 solar plants in the sector, you would have the same effect. Factory slots are very valuable in the early game, but the big problem of this perk is that every single NPC outpost in the game also has it. So after a day or so, you will have a pretty good surplus of energy cells in the entire galaxy. And later in the game, it gets really, really hard to actually draw any use from that. And you will only stockpile the energy cells. You can't sell them anymore because nobody really needs them. Well, occasionally you can find a factory which is ready to get another load of energy, and then one of your traders might sell them. But energy cells are really that type of resource which is just overflowing usually in most games, just like waste. There might be a shortage in the early game, but after some time you will have hundreds of thousands of energy cells in all outposts. And then you have to produce something from that to make any use from it. So you have to convert this energy into microchips or into crystals. And that costs factory support slots again for those factories. And what have you gained when you have to build more factories to draw any use from that? The solar panels can be useful in the early game because the value they create if you sell the energy is much higher than if you choose the tax perk. But late game, it loses a lot of value. And I would say this is a rather bad perk. It can be combined pretty well with the EMP because you are basically creating your own fuel at the location for the EMP. But energy is one of those overflowing resources. You really don't need that much more of that. And then this is completely useless. The taxation perk. This just gives you money. Well, I say just. It gives you a lot of money. But only really in the late game. The people in this outpost will be taxed and the value goes straight into your bank account. This is the biggest advantage of this perk. You don't have to sell anything, you're just getting free money. And people like to use this, from my experience, to balance out their constant maintenance costs, just to have that security that you are making money constantly, have this passive revenue. But the reality is that this tax is so low that it's a bad idea to choose that in the early game. Late game, it's one of the best perks in my opinion. If you have those many outposts, like 20 or something, and almost all of them have this taxation perk, then you are getting a lot of money and you can really maintain a sizable fleet with that, in addition to other passive income like from mining, for example. But in the early game, this really seems like a waste to me. You also have to be careful because this reduces the growth rate of your population, and this is important for shipyards because the population gets also consumed when you build ships. This will be different depending on how many turrets have to be operated in the ship. And usually small ships, if you build them, they get completed very quickly because they are cheap. But many small ships also require some people if they have turrets. And that means that if you build a lot of small ships, then your population drain will be very high in this outpost. And if you also choose the taxation perk in a shipyard outpost, that can mean that you are further harming yourself because your production speed goes down even further. So you have to be very careful, and I don't recommend to take this perk on shipyards. The only exception is when you also have the advanced engineering, because this also decreases your construction speed, and that means that the population has more time to regrow between the construction of different ships. So overall, I would rate the tax perk to have the biggest growth in its usefulness over the course of your game. It starts out pretty useless because the amount of money that you're getting is so low that it's not really worth the perk slot. Early game, you have serious perk greed. You want to choose all those perks. And then you cannot afford to take a useless one. You have to make every perk count. And tax is just not worth it. But late game, when you have many outposts and have many perk slots, it becomes one of the best perks possible because you will have trouble making enough money to finance your fleets, and all those outposts with the tax perk will add up, and the markets will be overflowing. You cannot sell stuff properly. You will have made some enemies, so you're losing additional trade partners. It can get really hard to make money in the late game. So the tax perk is a good staple, a good insurance for you that you're not going bankrupt. Really good perk, but only in the late game. So let's quickly recap the perk combination for a shipyard, because that is really the most important type of outpost in your game. The outpost where you build your ships. This is the one where you really have to be careful which perks you choose. And on all other outposts, you usually have much more perk slots available and don't have that pressure with the perks to choose the right perks. But for my shipyards, I always like to start with laser manufacture. This just saves you a load of resources. If you have this on a different outpost, then you will have insane inefficiencies in your empire and huge stockpiles of resources and weapons which have to be produced. And if you have this on your shipyard where you build your ships, then you will have this just-in-time economy where you just need the exact amount of resources to get what you want. That's just a no-brainer for me. Same with the insurance policy. The bad events are just too bad. You cannot ignore them. So those two are a must-have. And then I like to use the extra engine tuning. This is always the one I want to take, but usually I don't have the extra free perk slot in the early game. But later on, when I declare a permanent war or something, or get a bonus perk from the adjacency bonus connection, then I also always like to unlock the extra engine tuning. And then also the advanced engineering. But you have to be careful. If you are going to use advanced engineering, you will very likely definitely need more than one shipyard, even early in the game, because the construction time for new ships will be so long that you can get into real trouble if you need to replace a lot of ships very quickly. So be careful with this one. It is very tempting. The maintenance discount is huge, I agree, but the construction time, especially late game, can be dangerous. So for the early game, it's not that useful because you have the perk greed. You have less perks. You will likely start out with some other perk in your initial sector, like no food consumption. And then you want to make this sector into a shipyard, and you won't have as much perk slots left. So you usually cannot take this anyway. But if you take it, be careful and set up multiple shipyards. And then for the other type of outpost, which is pretty useless, doesn't have any specific job, I like to include the taxation perk, because there really you have to go big. You have to have many outposts with this perk to have any meaningful impact, to get a decent income going. And this is very important for the late game.